Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Feltner, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean at Seaver College. I want to thank you for joining us this evening for the third lecture in the 2016-2017 W. David Baird Distinguished Lecture Series. It's a privilege to welcome Dr. Katharine Hayhoe as our honored guest and speaker this evening. Katharine, we thank you for your work and for the scientifically sound, faith-informed Christian voice you're bringing to one of the most challenging topics facing the world, climate change. We're grateful that you were able to join us tonight, and we look forward to your presentation. Before beginning this evening's program, it's my great pleasure to welcome the Dean Emeritus of Seaver College, David Baird. David, would you please stand so we can acknowledge you? Our format for this evening is quite simple. Dr. Hayhoe will address us for approximately 50 to 60 minutes. Following her address, we will immediately move into a question and answer session. I would ask that you please remain present for the entire evening, including both the presentation and the Q&A. If you do have to excuse yourself, I ask you to do so, please, as unobtrusively as possible. If you are going to ask a question, we will have microphones that will circulate the room so that everyone can hear you, and for recording purposes, we would ask that you please wait for the microphone before asking your question. Introducing our speaker this evening is Professor of Religion, Dr. Chris Duran. Dr. Duran is a skilled educator, accomplished scholar, and a leader. Chris has been integral in establishing a sustainability minor at Seaver College, in establishing the Eden House, a sustainable residence hall on our campus, in organizing and hosting the recent Climate Calling Conference at Pepperdine, and most importantly, in raising our collective conscience about our responsibility as a faith-informed community to address issues related to climate change. Chris is the ideal person to introduce tonight's speaker. Chris.
Good evening. At Pepperdine, we are convicted by our mission to strengthen students for lives of purpose, service, and leadership. We faculty often say that it is one of our tasks to help students find their vocation. We regularly recite Frederick Buechner's famous quotation, "Vocation is the place where our deep gladness meets the world's deep need." If Buechner's definition is correct, then I think we will hear from someone tonight who has found this place. We should make no mistake, we are firmly entrenched within the Anthropocene era. The effects of 150 years at least of anthropogenic climate change are being felt presently and will undoubtedly shape the future of human civilization and the biodiversity of this planet for generations to come. It is the most pressing issue of our time. Thankfully, many, like our speaker tonight, have recognized that their vocation is to help us understand the ripple effects of climate change and how it will challenge the ways in which we will love our neighbors as ourselves now and into the future. As our speaker said in a recent interview with Slate.com, Christians of all people should care about climate change, quote, because it is affecting people and is disproportionately affecting the poor and the vulnerable and those who cannot care for themselves. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. She hails from Toronto, Canada, and still holds her citizenship there, which she's very proud of. She studied physics and astronomy at the University of Toronto, and then earned her PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois. She is now an associate professor in the political science department and the director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University. She is the daughter of Christian missionaries who spent time in Colombia during her youth. And in multiple interviews, she has given her father a great deal of credit for shaping her approach to science and religion and how they work together in her own Christian witness. In one such interview, she said, quote, "For him, there was never any conflict between the idea that there is a God and the idea that science explains the world that we see around us." Dr. Hayhoe has obviously taken her father's words to heart as she has proclaimed this affirmation over and over again to all those who might listen, especially those within her evangelical faith community. For many in the evangelical community, to suggest that science and religion are not in conflict makes her iconoclastic, even though most of Christian history has declared that science and faith work together. For example, Academy Award-nominated actor Don Cheadle acknowledged as much when he wrote for Dr. Hayhoe as one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in 2014, "There's something fascinating about a smart person who defies stereotype." She also defies another significant stereotype. She is a scientist who can communicate effectively with non-scientists. As a biology major from Seaver College, I frequently joke with my former professors and now my current colleagues that if they were better at speaking English, then we would be long past the supposed evolution and creationism debate and the questions about whether or not climate change are real. Unfortunately, too many scientists communicate in labese rather than in everyday language that non-scientists can easily understand. But fortunately for us, Dr. Hayhoe is renowned for her ability to communicate about climate change in ways that anyone with or without a PhD in atmospheric science can understand. She recently received the American Geophysical Union Award for Climate Communication, and another scientist in her field said in a 2013 interview with the LA Times, "She is perhaps the best communicator on climate change in the nation." I could continue on mentioning the names of numerous awards that she has earned. For example, Foreign Policy's 2014 Leading 100 Global Thinkers, named one of Politico's 2016 50 Thinkers, Doers, and Visionaries Transforming Politics. I could talk about the stage she has shared with the likes of former President Obama and Leonardo DiCaprio, or the title she has been given. For example, Emily Gertz called her recently the scientist who might end the climate culture wars. No pressure there. Instead, I would like to read 3 sentences in conclusion from her website that might tell us more about her than all the rest that could be mentioned. She says, quote, "These are all tremendous honors for which I am enormously grateful and constantly surprised. What means the most to me personally, though, is that when just one person tells me sincerely that they had never cared about climate change before or even thought it was real, but now, because of something they heard me say, they've changed their mind. That's what makes it all worthwhile." Listening to her before and seeing her interact with students personally today for the first time, I sincerely believe that her deep gladness meets the world's deepest and enduring need. Her lecture tonight is part of her vocation. Indeed, it is part of her Christian witness. Please give a warm Pepperdine Waves welcome to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Chris. It's great to be here in person. About 2 years ago, I was able to Skype in for a special viewing of The Years of Living Dangerously. And I got to see a little bit of your faces, but you saw my face large on the screen. Now I'm normal-sized, and instead we get to see what we're talking about, which is something near and dear to my heart, the idea of loving our global neighbor. I grew up in Canada, and when I was 9 years old, my parents packed up the family and moved us all down to South America. It was certainly a learning experience moving down there in the pre-internet days, when long-distance phone calls cost $5 a minute and mail took three weeks to get there if you were lucky, 6 months if you weren't. And one of the biggest things I learned down there is how closely people live to nature and how deeply we are impacted by natural disasters. Whether it is torrential rains that cause landslides that wash away people's homes, whether it's droughts that leave families without food and the ability to feed their children. We are to a large degree insulated from many of these things that affect the poor and the vulnerable around the world. And so one of the biggest lessons that experience left me with was how important it is to think of others who don't have what we have. When we look at this world that we live in, although it would be nice to picture it as this, all of us holding hands around the world, we often think of it as if we were one of those astronauts up in the International Space Station. I don't know if you follow any of those people on Twitter, but there's some amazing people, and they post some incredible pictures. And we often think of the world as this pristine, untouched globe, just the way God created it. But these days, we're pushing 7.5 billion people on this planet. And so today, a more accurate way to look at our planet, I believe, is not a picture of how it looks in the daytime, but rather a picture of how it looks at night. This is literally a photograph of the Earth. If you were up in the International Space Station, this is what you would see as you passed over that part of the Earth at night. What is that? Those are the lights of billions of people. If we zoom in on the United States, you can actually see it more closely, can't you? You're looking at cities, and we're looking at the roads connecting the cities. You can map out the transportation system of the United States looking at this picture. Isn't that crazy? With 7.5 billion people, every place where we can build a major city, every waterway, every nice coastal location, it's been built on. No one is more conscious of that than people in California, where every square inch of land, it seems like, goes for thousands of dollars. Every acre of arable land has been allocated, purchased, and cultivated. And increasingly, every drop of water has been measured out and allocated. We've gotten to the point now where with 7.5 billion people, in some places of the world, there isn't enough land to go around. In some parts of the world, there isn't enough cropland to go around. And especially as we've seen here in California the last few years, when droughts come, as they always do, there isn't enough water to go around. This idea of having more people than the planet can support has led to the concept of planetary boundaries. You may have heard of this. It's an idea that in many different areas, in terms of our land systems, the integrity of our biosphere, the nitrogen cycle, as well as issues like climate change, there's boundaries to what we can do. And so one of the things I often hear is, well, why don't you just talk about how the only way to fix the problems we have is to have less people in the world? The reality is that's not actually the problem. Because I don't know if you've ever done something like this. There's these little websites that you can go to, and you can put in what type of life you live, how much food you consume, how much meat you eat, how much space you take up, how much fossil fuels you use, how much water you drink and use. And then these little websites will tell you how many Earths we would need to support your personal lifestyle. I did that, and here is what would be needed if you lived my lifestyle. To live my lifestyle, we would need 5 planets. And my lifestyle really isn't that bad. I got to give good answers to some of the questions. And furthermore, I take up about 30 acres of land in terms of what's required to grow the food that I eat. And currently, we have around the world about 0.6 acres per person under cultivation. You get the picture here, right? So, if we eliminated the 6 billion people who live with much less than we do, what would that accomplish? Not much. The whole point is that a small number of us are using a large proportion of the Earth's resources. That's really the issue. And going back to this picture, we can start to see one of the ways in which we are disproportionately using the resources that we have. If you cast your eyes up to North Dakota, which I've helpfully drawn a yellow square around for the geographically challenged, what you see up there is not a major city. There are no major cities up there of that size. No offense to anybody from North Dakota. What you're looking at up there are the lights of thousands of fracking wells. If you look at world population, when did it start to grow exponentially? It started to grow exponentially right around the time of the Industrial Revolution. That was when we figured out how to dig massive amounts of coal and natural gas eventually and oil out of the ground and burn it. And fossil fuels that powered the Industrial Revolution brought us the tremendous benefits that we enjoy today and contributed directly to the expansion of our population. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the fossil fuels that powered it, we have things like refrigeration that we often take for granted. But what happens when there's a power blackout? Your food goes bad. What happens if you live without a refrigerator? You have to spend a lot of time getting food every day, or else you run the risk of running food that is contaminated and makes you sick. What other things do we have that we wouldn't have had 300 years ago? Light bulbs, electricity. And I don't know about you, but that certainly has changed our lives, hasn't it? We use a lot of this energy to power machines that make our life so much easier. Machines that we use to travel. Imagine if you still had to travel on horses these days. Imagine that. They say that if we all traveled on horses, there would be, manure up to the second level of some cities, but there wouldn't be as many people back then either. And perhaps most importantly, the Industrial Revolution powered incredible medical advances. The things that people died from back then are not things that we typically die from today. I mean, I think about what's happened in my own life, and if I was born 300 years ago, I probably wouldn't be alive today. And many of you wouldn't either. Average life expectancy was incredibly low back then. So if we look around the world, we see that there are actually 1 billion people in the world who still live in energy poverty today. The orange circles show how many millions of people don't have electricity at all. And again, just think about what electricity does for you. They don't have electricity, and the red are people who don't have clean cooking facilities. So in other words, they often have to cook with wood indoors that leads to terrible pollution, diseases, and even death. So when we look at issues like this, often our first response is to say, well, if you go back and if you look at what happened to us, how did we develop? How were we able to massively improve our quality of life, our technology, our medicine, our health? How are we able to improve? We were able to improve powered by fossil fuels. So we look at people around the world and we say, well, clearly, if we're going to fix other people's problems, they need fossil fuels too, right? I hear this argument frequently and often in Christian circles. There's two big problems, though, with that argument today. The first problem is if you look around the world, for example, these are global coal deposits, so wherever is black is a coal deposit. The first problem is, first of all, these deposits are finite. They are going to run out eventually. But a bigger problem is, look at where this energy occurs. And if you look at a map of gas and oil, it's not much different. So, what continents are the ones where people live in poverty? Remember? And what continents are the ones that have vast resources of fossil fuels? Pretty much exactly the opposite, right? In fact, I actually made a pie chart. It's easier to see if it's a pie chart, right? Remaining coal and gas and oil reserves around the world. Well, North America is well off. We have 37%. That's a lot. Europe has 20%. They're okay. The Middle East has a huge amount, 20%. Latin America, mostly Venezuela, has 14%. And then the people in Africa and Asia have 6% and 3% respectively. So if we're going to help people get out of poverty, and if energy is a big part of that, which it is, getting machines to do something instead of us. I mean, you know how much time you have to spend literally going to the well to get water and going to get food? You know how much of your day is spent in those activities if you do not have access to energy? Sometimes your whole day. I don't know if you've ever washed clothes without a machine. I have done it. It's the whole day. Anyways, they don't have the fossil fuel resources. So what are you going to do? Are you going to go to a poor country and say, let us build you a coal-powered plant because that is how we did it, but now you have to go buy your coal from us from the rest of your life? What's more, going to them and saying that is kind of like saying, well, we used coal way back when, so you can get a party line telephone. You're not at the point in your development yet where you deserve a cell phone. You can do what we did 100 years ago. That's a bit patronizing as well. So the problem with development is we can't fix it with fossil fuels because they don't have them. And then there's another problem with fossil fuels, which is this. These are the Appalachians. You've probably seen them if you've been to the eastern US. The Appalachians have a lot of coal in them. The easiest way to get the coal out of the mountains is to cut the top off them. Cutting the top off the mountains is the cheapest way for companies to get it, but it isn't cheap for the people who live there. This is by a friend of mine, Marianne Hitt, who writes extensively about the issues in Appalachia. And she says specifically, mountaintop removal allows toxic heavy metals to leach into local water supplies. People who live in mining areas, especially mountaintop removal mining areas, have higher incidence of cancer, heart disease, kidney disease, birth defects, terrible things. There are extremely negative effects associated with taking the stuff out of the ground and associated with burning it. Living north of LA, I'm sure you know what air pollution looks like. Most of it comes from cars. And around the world, this is a crazy number, but it's real. Around the world, 5.5 million people die every year from air pollution. Half of those because they lack clean cooking facilities, and so they're burning stuff inside their homes to cook with, and the other half mostly from cars and other burning of fossil fuels. In the United States, this number is 200,000 people. 200,000 people every year die prematurely from air pollution in the United States. Imagine if 200,000 people died from other causes. Imagine if Zika were killing 200,000 people a year. The CDC would be in a very different position than it is today. Imagine if domestic terrorists were killing 200,000 people a year. Imagine the calls for fixing the problem that would come then. Somehow, because this problem has been around a long time, we've become immune, even calloused to it. Especially because it isn't happening to everybody proportionally. People who live in poor neighborhoods who can't afford to buy or rent a house that's not right beside the freeway or right beside a factory, those are the people who are disproportionately affected by burning this stuff. And so, saying we can rely on fossil fuels to dig us out of the problems that we're in is actually a way of deepening, and I didn't invent this, it's actually a way of deepening the divide between haves and have-nots, both here at home as well as in other countries around the world. So these are two of the problems, but there's one other big problem. And that big problem is the one that was right on the top of the planetary boundaries list, climate change. That's the one that I study. Why is climate change related to fossil fuels? What's the relationship? When you burn coal, or gas or oil, most of what you see coming out of this smokestack is steam. What you're actually looking at is steam. What you're not looking at are the invisible heat-trapping gases that are also coming out. Because whenever you burn this stuff, it turns into carbon dioxide. The carbon in the fuel combines with oxygen when you burn it. Carbon dioxide is the result. We've been producing a lot of this stuff. We know how much we've been producing because when you buy and sell things, you write them down. And so we have a very good idea of how much extra carbon we have been producing. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because, let me get this little video started. Oh, come on. There we go. It's a problem because our planet actually has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases already. This natural blanket lets the sun shine straight through it, almost like a window. There it goes. And then the planet heats up and gives off heat energy. But this natural blanket traps the heat energy, keeping us just the perfect temperature for life. We would be a frozen ball of ice about 60 degrees Fahrenheit colder than we are today, around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, if it wasn't for this amazing natural blanket. So you might say, well, if it's natural, what's the problem? The problem is that we are adding an extra blanket that our planet never needed by digging up coal and gas and oil and burning it. And just like I would, when you're sleeping and your grandma sneaks into your room and puts an extra blanket on you that you didn't need, you wake up sweating and you say, Grandma, I didn't need that extra blanket. In the same way, we're wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it didn't need. And as a result, it is running a fever. That is the connection between climate change, energy, and our planetary boundaries. Now, between the months of about November and April, there's one question that I get quite a lot. And it's this question, usually accompanied by a look like this. Global warming, I'd like a little bit of that. It's freezing outside. What are you talking about? You don't get this question this summer, only in the winter. The answer, of course, is that we're not talking about weather change. Weather is what happens in a certain place at a certain time. It's like a single tree. Climate is like a forest. It's the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years, not just in one place, but all around the world. So when it's cold outside, we're tempted to say, where's global warming now? And earlier today, when we were talking together with Q&A with students, we talked about how actually, as a result of a warming Arctic, the jet stream is starting to wiggle and wobble and bring massive cold Arctic air masses all the way down south. So we're actually seeing some record cold temperatures at the same time as the planet is warming. But at the same time, we have to remember that saying it's cold here where I live on this day, therefore the entire planet is not warming over climate timescales, is similar to being on the Titanic and saying, well, we can't be sinking because my end just went 200 feet up in the air. We have to look at global temperature, not just in one place, not just in 1 year, not just in 10 years. We have to look at global temperature using thousands of thermometers from all around the entire world. And when we look at global temperature around the entire world, this is what we see. That's not really going up, is it? But hang on a second. How many years are we looking at here? And how many years did I say climate is measured over? 20 to 30. So if we add in the rest of the data, you can see that actually, yes, over climate timescales, we have ups and downs. Some years are cooler, some are warmer. Sometimes the trend slows down, sometimes it speeds up. But over climate timescales, there is no question that we are definitely getting warmer. Now, you will read news articles all the time talking about how, oh, that temperature data, those scientists are always manipulating that temperature data. There was articles even this past week saying that. Nothing ever changes. Now, leaving aside the difficulty of manipulating tens of thousands of weather stations around the world, and doing so not just at one location in the United States, but the Japanese keep separate records, the Brits keep separate records, NASA keeps separate records. So you'd have to somehow coordinate among thousands of scientists and tens of thousands of weather stations around the entire world, not just for a year or two, but for decades and even centuries. That's a pretty big conspiracy to never find out about. But if you manage to do that, then sure, you could definitely fiddle the temperature record. And I have a piece of land in Florida for you to buy. But let's throw out the temperature record. Let's get rid of the satellite data. Let's get rid of all of the data that scientists measure, and instead, let's just look at what God's creation is telling us. If you go to the Arctic, you see that ground that used to be permanently frozen is now thawing and crumbling and falling into the ocean, literally taking people's homes with it. If you go to Japan, you see that they've been keeping records of when the cherry blossoms flowered, because they have a festival, the Cherry Blossom Festival. They've been keeping records of when those trees flowered for 1,100 years. And those trees are flowering now on average 3 weeks earlier in the year than they have in 1,100 years, because spring is coming earlier. If you go to the tropics, you see that heavy rains are increasing. Why? Because in a warmer world, water evaporates faster, and so more water evaporates out of the oceans, and it's sitting there up there in the atmosphere waiting for a storm to come along and pick it up and dump it. And that's exactly what's happening. And if you look along the Gulf of Mexico, we see hurricanes are not getting any more frequent, but they're getting stronger. Why? Because they get their energy from a warm ocean. And you know that extra blanket around our planet? Over 90% of that extra heat that's being trapped by the blanket is actually going into the ocean. And it's powering stronger hurricanes. When we look around God's creation, there are, ready for this number, it's a big number, there are 26,500 independent indicators of a warming planet. Some of them in our own backyards and some of them in your backyard right here. Plants that I saw today that have 40-foot roots that are very drought resistant couldn't cope with the recent drought. Plants that can't cope and shrubs that can't cope with fire, can't cope with the more recent fires that you're seeing here. Your climate in your backyard is changing, and you can see it in the plants that grow on the mountains behind the school. So then people might say, okay, it's getting warmer, but I know it's been warmer before, right? If you've seen the Ice Age movies. Yes, trust me. Once you get to the point where you have a toddler, those things will just be on the repeat button. So if you have seen an Ice Age movie, you know, yes, the world has been different before. And there are natural reasons why the world has been different before. There's natural cycles, and there's changes in energy from the sun. And the people who study those things are called climate scientists. So in short, when we go to the natural reasons why climate has changed in the past, let's go first of all to the sun. If we look at the Earth's temperature, this is the Earth's temperature. The wiggly line is year to year, and the thick line is long-term average. If we look at the Earth's temperature, if it were warming because of the energy from the sun changing, I want you to get your thumbs ready. Ready? Give me a thumb. Do you think that would mean that the sun's energy would be going up to make us warmer, or the sun's energy would have to be going down to make us warmer? Thumbs, brave people. Excellent. Everybody gets the right answer. Yes, it would have to be going up. So let's look at the sun's energy. Well, up until about the 1950s, it was going up, and then it plateaued, and then it started to go down. The sun's energy has an 11-year sunspot cycle, and then it has long-term, chaotic, unpredictable trends. Well, according to the sun, we should be cooling right now, not warming. So it can't be the sun. What about natural cycles? Natural cycles like El Nino that are inside the Earth system, all they do is move heat around. They can't create or destroy it, they just move it around. So they can't be responsible for warming of the entire planet, atmosphere, and ocean, because all they can do is move the heat around, not actually make it out of thin air. The only natural cycles that can cause the whole planet to change are the cycles in the Earth's orbit that bring the ice ages and the warm periods like we're in right now. So you might say, okay, well, we're just getting warmer. We're just getting warmer after the squirrel chased the nut and broke off the iceberg, and yeah, the only people laughing are the ones who've seen the movie. But if we look at our history, these are the last 6,000 years on planet Earth. What was happening? There was a very, very slow, gradual cooling because the next thing on our geologic calendar was another ice age. Was. Good news. Nobody wants another ice age. I don't. What's the perfect temperature for humans, people often ask me. What do you think the perfect temperature is? The perfect temperature is, not to jump back too far here, but just a reminder, the perfect temperature is the temperature we had when our population went from a few 100 million to a few billion, right? That's the perfect temperature for us. We like it just right. Like Goldilocks, we don't want it too cold. We don't want it too hot. We want it just right. So then, I'll put in carbon dioxide here. There aren't any other major natural cycles. You can't say there's some random natural cycle that's causing us to warm. There weren't any major natural cycles. There was just a very, very slow, gradual decrease, and then boom, something happened. And when did that happen? Right at the Industrial Revolution. It isn't the sun, and it isn't a natural cycle. And the last thing you'll often hear is, well, it's such a new science that we should probably just study it some more, because scientists aren't 100% sure. If you beat the bushes, you can find, and I can count them on the fingers of one hand, you can find this many scientists in the United States who are ready to say that this isn't really necessarily humans. Now, you have several thousand on this side, but if you beat the bushes and you turn on the TV, you can find these 5. So you might say, we should study it some more because it's really a new science. We don't know enough about it yet. Here's the problem with that argument. The problem is that we've known that the planet had a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases, keeping us 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we should be, since Fourier right here. Same Fourier you might have studied in math. How long have we known that burning fossil fuels is wrapping an extra blanket around the planet? Since Tyndale in the 1850s. That's over 160 years ago. How long have we known how much the planet would warm and how much faster the Arctic would warm than the rest of the world? Since Arrhenius, the balding guy in the middle. He built the first climate model by hand based on physics that we knew back in the 1890s. It took him 2 years to calculate how much the Earth would warm, and his numbers were embarrassingly similar to the most powerful supercomputers we have today. Somewhere around the second Christmas, I believe, his wife packed up and left. Because he was actually a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, and calculating the temperature of the Earth in response to this experiment we were conducting with it was what he did in his free time. Guy Callender, the next one, was the first person to publish a paper in 1938 showing that global temperature, measured by thousands of thermometers around the world, was actually increasing because of fossil fuel use. His paper is so fascinating because it starts off by saying, and I'm paraphrasing, "You're never going to believe what I'm going to tell you, but it is actually true, and if you follow through on my arguments, you will understand how humans are affecting the temperature of the planet." 1938. And then Charles Keeling was the first person to actually start monitoring these heat-trapping gases on Mauna Loa in Hawaii starting in the 1950s. So sure, it is legitimate to say we don't know enough, we need to study it more. It was very legitimate to say that 100 years ago. But it's been 52 years now since scientists were sure enough to formally warn a US president of the dangers of climate change, and that president was Lyndon B. Johnson. That's how long it's been. Here's the question, though. Here is the real question. The real question is, why do we care? Because if you are going to go see a movie about global warming, if you're going to go pick up a book about global warming in the bookstore, you're going to be cruising through those aisles or looking at those posters, looking for something that has one image on the cover, because there is one image associated with climate change in our minds. That one thing is large, and it is white, and it's furry, and it is a, thank you, exactly, you know what I'm talking about, preferably a polar bear sitting on a piece of melting ice looking really sad. And the reality is if we are talking about changing the entire way that we have built our society, remember we're talking about the Industrial Revolution? All the benefits we've got from that, all based on fossil fuels. If we're talking about changing our entire society, our entire economic and energy system, just to save the polar bear, I don't think that's gonna work. Don't get me wrong, I love polar bears. But if you told me you can never drive a car again, and I'm not giving you anything else to drive to save the polar bears, I'd be like, put them in a zoo. I've been to the Winnipeg Zoo. They have the biggest polar bear habitat in the world, and it's quite nice. The reason we care about climate change is because after the polar bear, we're next. That's why we care about climate change. The polar bear is warning us what is going to happen to us if we don't heed its warning. What am I talking about here? Cities. Did you know that 2/3 of the world's biggest cities are located within a few feet of sea level? And sea level is going to rise a few feet this century. Why? First of all, because land-based ice is melting and flowing into the ocean, but even more because warmer water takes up more space. And remember how much of the extra heat trapped by that blanket's going into the ocean? Over 90%. Why do we care about climate change? Because every acre of arable land is already allocated, and if you can't grow crops on your land in West Texas anymore, you can't just move up to Kansas and take over somebody's farm. That doesn't go so well. 1,000 years ago, we could have picked up our tents and moved. Today, we can't. And lastly, this is the same slide. I'm just showing you what the point is here. We already don't have enough water to go around in dry years. And when it gets warmer, water evaporates faster, which means that our droughts are getting stronger and our reservoir levels are dropping faster. I'm working with the city of Austin, and they are seriously considering putting some type of oil on their reservoirs to prevent evaporation, and even considering pumping the water underground. Because evaporation is a killer in a warmer world for water resource managers. We care about climate change because it is increasing the risk of heavy downpours. Whether you live in North America, as this girl does with the shorts, or whether you live in Bangladesh, it has a huge impact on us. We care about it, again, because during droughts, If they're warmer, water evaporates faster and it dries out our soils and our reservoirs more quickly. Whether you live in Texas, a lake near where I live in Texas, or whether you live in Syria, where the drought was part of what drove over 1 million people to abandon their land and go into the cities. We care about a changing climate because hurricanes like Sandy are getting stronger, because permafrost up in the Arctic is thawing and crumbling, affecting our infrastructure, and because heat waves, whether they're in Australia or India, are getting more intense, and heat waves drive people to the hospital and they even kill people. The heat wave in Europe in 2003, which has been calculated to be twice as frequent now as it would have been 100 years ago, that heat wave killed 70,000 people. That's a big number. Would that heat wave have occurred naturally? Well, sure. If you have 2 dice, there's always a chance of rolling a double 6. But what climate change is doing is sneaking in while we're not looking and replacing one of those numbers with another 6. And then another decade or 2 later, another 6. So the chances of rolling these bad events are going up. Why do we care about a changing climate? We care about it because it exacerbates many of the risks that we already face today. 9 times out of 10, the way that climate change affects us is it takes whatever is already bad, wildfire, drought, heavy rain, landslides, whatever it is that we suffer from in the place we already live, and it makes it worse. That's us. And I don't know about you, but where I live, I have flood insurance. When there's a disaster, they call out the National Guard. But if we look around the world and we say, who is most vulnerable to these changes, they live in different places. They live in places where if their home is washed away, there is no insurance to help rebuild. If a famine decimates their crop, they literally have no food to feed their family. If the land in which they live becomes inhabitable, they have to move and they end up in a refugee camp. We care about a changing climate because it affects real people today, and it especially affects the poor and the vulnerable, the very people who we as Christians are told repeatedly to care for. You might say, though, but there's really more urgent issues, right? Because people are dying today because they don't have enough food to eat. They're dying today because they're drinking contaminated water. They're dying today of diseases that nobody should die of in 2017. And that is absolutely true. But the reality is this: pouring all of our money and all of our effort, all of our prayers and hope and time into a bucket to try to help people, to try to end poverty, address global hunger, cure diseases. If we leave climate change out of the picture, it's like trying to fix this problem when there's a hole in the bucket, and the hole is climate change, and the hole is getting bigger and bigger. We can't afford to leave it out of the picture anymore because we won't be able to fix all the other problems that we know exist in the world today. So that's as far as the science can take us. Science can tell us, yes, climate is changing. Science can tell us, for the first time, it really is us. It is not a natural cycle anymore. And science can tell us that the impacts are serious and they matter to us. But science can't tell us what to do. Science is like a compass. It can tell you north and south, east and west, but science doesn't know where you're going. For that, you need the map. And what is our map? Our map, often, is the Bible. That is the map that tells us about our attitudes and our actions, our perspectives and our responses. So there's no verse in the Bible that talks about climate change. I mean, the Bible was written 2,000 years ago, people. What do you expect? You know, there's prophecy and then there's prophecy. There's nothing about climate change in the Bible. But there are a lot of verses that have to do with our attitudes and our actions and our perspectives, right? Like this one from 1 John. If any of us who has worldly means sees someone in need and refuses them compassion, how can the love of God remain in us? Let us not love in word and speech, but in deed and truth. How can we love those who are suffering, both here and around the world? And then in Ephesians, Paul exhorts us to walk in love as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for you, a sacrificial love, considering others' needs above our own. And then there's the Texas translation of the Bible, which is primarily published on road signs. This is one of those signs. I like this one. That love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, God. How can we love our neighbor who doesn't have enough food to eat and who is worried about the changes that they are seeing today? How can we love our neighbor who already doesn't have access to clean water or to the medical technology or even just the medicine they need? At this point, the president's science advisor said, John Holdren, at this point we basically have three choices. We can reduce our emissions, we can adapt, and we can suffer. And for a scientist to say suffer, that's a bit different. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. And that is where our faith comes in. What does the Bible tell us? The Bible tells us that the love of God is already in our hearts. It's been poured out in our hearts through the Holy Spirit who is given to us, so that Christ can dwell in our hearts through faith, and that we, being rooted and grounded in love, can do just as we want to in our heart. Do you know that you have a new heart that wants to do the right thing? Our attitudes and actions and our minds are certainly being renewed. We feel that tension every day. But our heart desires to give. And I know this verse is usually used to talk about money, but honestly, you can get more money, you cannot get more time. So whatever it is that we're giving, our prayers, our time, our concern, our effort, our money, God wants us to do it cheerfully, out of love, not guilt, and especially not out of fear. Because when I hear people talking about climate change, and when I hear people talking about the economy, when I hear people talking about almost anything today, fear is often the dominant emotion that comes through, isn't it? Sometimes anger with fear underneath. And this verse is a litmus test for us. If it's fear, it is not from God. What comes from God? A spirit of power to get stuff done, a spirit of love to put others' needs before our own, and this is my favorite one as a scientist, a sound mind to make rational, common sense decisions. Isn't that amazing? So this is the last question, though. At this point, you might be saying, sure, I get the attitudes, I get the actions, but what do I actually do? You know, because we're talking about what we can do. Here's the thing, though. Being part of the body of Christ tells us that we are each unique. Who you are is a unique and special manifestation of God in this world. Each of us has different gifts. Each of us has different abilities, talents, interests, and different desires in our heart. So while I can't tell us what specifically you should do as opposed to you should do, we know that God's ministries are carried out everywhere, but they all originate in his Spirit. His expressions of power are in action everywhere, but God is behind it all. Each of us is given something to do that shows who God is. What might that look like? I'm going to give you just a few examples to end with. And they're only examples because you are a different person than the person sitting beside you. What's one of the most important things we can do? One of the things we can do is talk about this issue, because did you know that about 3/4 of people in the United States talk about this only a couple of times a year or less? It isn't that we don't think it's real, it's that we don't think it's important. What else could we do? Go find a carbon footprint calculator and figure out where your carbon comes from. A lot of mine comes from travel. Somebody else's might come from their big truck. Somebody else's might just come from what they eat. There's many different ways that we produce this stuff. And then once we know where it comes from, we can take sensible steps, like replacing the light bulb. If everybody replaced their light bulbs, we'd save $250 billion in electricity every year. That's an insane amount. And it would replace more than 800,000 cars. If we go from being a meat lover to an average person, we shrink our carbon footprint immediately. You cut out beef, you shrink it even more. Now, I live in Texas. It's hard to go without a good barbecue once in a while, but I don't have to eat it every day. I have a little PBS digital series called Global Weirding. They're short 5-minute videos intended to start conversations, and the video from this week is, I'm just one person, what can I do? So check it out, because there are so many things that we can do. I love Climate Caretakers because it's an online Christian community that encourages us with an idea every month of what we can do acting in community. Check them out and sign up. Consider how we could work together for corporate action in our church, where one church decided they were going to provide their roof to the community, to their neighbors, as a solar garden. Or Houghton College, a tiny little college, much smaller than Pepperdine, they have the biggest solar array of any educational institute in all of New York. That's pretty impressive, and it puts Cornell to shame. But the bottom line is, whether we live in the United States or whether we live in India, we need to acknowledge that this is real. It is. Our brothers and sisters are suffering today from this real issue. We need to help people prepare, whether it's incredible fog nets. This is a prettier version of what you have yourselves up the mountain. Working to end energy poverty with resources that they do have, because if you look at a map, remember we saw the map of where coal is? Remember that? Here's a map of where solar energy is. There's plenty of that around. There's organizations that we can support. Plant with Purpose, down in the bottom corner, plants trees and works with people in the local economy in Haiti. Micah Challenge is named so because our vulnerable neighbors who've contributed the least to causing climate change are being the most harmed by it. And there's chapters of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action on campuses across the United States. One of my favorite organizations, too, is Citizens Climate Lobby, which has chapters all around the country and is designed to tell elected officials that we care about this issue, no matter who we are and where we come from. Because the bottom line is that caring about God's creation, caring about the people and all living things that are already being affected by climate change today, according to the Bible, is a genuine expression of our faith. According to Genesis 1, it is a faithful acceptance of our responsibility. And, according to the whole New Testament, it is a true expression of God's love. My favorite scientist is Jane Goodall, and she said something this year that I think profoundly resonates on this issue. She said, "It's only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential." What do we have in our hearts? We have the love of God that has been poured out unstintingly upon us to share with others. And we have been told that in our lives, the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love. Thank you. If you're a student who has a class, now's the time to leave. If you're not, you're welcome to move forward and join us because we do have time for Q&A afterwards. Okay, we have some microphones that are going around. There's one right back there in the middle and one right up here. So if you have a question, go ahead. I will also say, too, while we're getting the microphone to somebody, if you don't want to ask your question in public, and I totally understand, our Global Weirding series comes out every other Wednesday, and then the next day, on Thursday, I have a Facebook live chat where I answer people's questions. You don't have to actually say them, you can just type them in. And I usually get through about 150 questions in half an hour. So if you're interested, you can join us on Facebook. The next one is not tomorrow, but next week. But if you're brave enough, ask your question here. All right, we have one. Yes?
Last year we heard from Bill McKibben.
It is, okay. Bring the mics up. It is not on.
Hi. Is it on?
Let me give you this one.
Oh, now it is.
There it goes. It's on now.
Okay. Last year we heard from Bill McKibben about systemic change and that sometimes the individual actions weren't enough now and that we really needed to leverage. Do you have anything to say about what we can do collectively that would make a difference?
Yes. One of the biggest things we can do is to tell people that we care. For a long time, we've been talking about recycling and changing light bulbs. And don't get me wrong, those have tremendous impact. We recycle at our university. Our city barely recycles. Our city has all these bins where you literally have to separate, I'm not kidding, you separate clear plastic from translucent plastic, from colored plastic, and so on and so forth. It usually took me about 2 or 3 hours to separate my recycling every week. And then one of my students in public administration who was studying recycling decided she was going to find out what the city did with it. She followed the city's trucks to the garbage dump. Yes. So our university picked up the slack. They recycle themselves with student interns, and they fund 35 students. That's how many scholarships they provide through recycling. So we've been told to change light bulbs. We've been told to recycle. It has great benefits, but we have to change the world. And the biggest way we have to change is we have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and replace that with energy, because we don't want to return to the Middle Ages. We have to replace that with energy that does not pollute and will not run out on us. But here's the cool thing. We're already doing it. Did you know that Texas already gets 20% of its electricity from wind? Texas. They're not doing it because they're a bunch of tree huggers. We don't have trees where we live. They're doing it because it just makes financial sense. Did you know that China has cut their coal emissions and they're shutting down half-built coal plants for 3 years in a row now? Why? Because wind and solar and hydro is cheaper than coal, and they know the tremendous impact it has on people's lives. So yes, we do need to change the world, but the good news is, number one is it's already underway, and number two is we just have to speed it up. That is really the issue. It has to happen faster than it is right now. Thank you. Next question. Sure. Let's get you a microphone just so that if you could come all the way down here, and then you can get the next question. Just so everybody can hear you in the back. I can hear you fine.
Hi there. First of all, thank you so much for your coming out. I have a bit of a cold. I first heard you at our former Vice President Al Gore's training in Houston. Yes. I follow you on every single global weirding. I'm Lane Semper. We're desperately trying to get Aliso Canyon converted to wind and solar. So I was wondering, 20%, if you can do it, we can certainly do it for the valley. Do you know how they got the ball rolling? Because we've spoken out at every city council, supervisor, senator, you name it.
That's a great question. I am not involved in it personally, but I know somebody who is, and so I can put you in touch with the guy who can tell you exactly the answer to that question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
I just reap the benefits. Yes.
I'm grateful because now I can use that in my comments.
I know, saying if Texas did it, we can do it is pretty powerful. Nobody wants to be behind. Yes. All right, you have a question right there.
As well, I want to thank you for being here to speak with us. This has been really great to hear about. And so my question is, on a political level, is there an effort to work with companies such as oil companies or coal companies to make sure that they don't feel like they're being given the short end of the stick as we transition into more eco-friendly methods of producing energy? Because it seems like if we can accommodate the number of jobs that are produced by agriculture, for example, in California, and use up a lot of water, if we help those who are in the oil and gas industries as well, that there might be a lot more momentum as we try to transition. So my question was, is that any part of the talks as to maybe subsidizing for these companies or looking for jobs for the people who are already entrenched in what they're doing right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to make a very clear distinction, I think, between the companies versus the people who work for them. Fossil fuel companies are subsidized around the world to the tune of trillions of dollars. Huge subsidies that dwarf the subsidies on clean energy. The corporations are some of the richest in the world. If you Google, biggest corporations in the world, Apple's at the top, and then you have a bunch of fossil fuel companies. They have had all the time, and I know this because I actually interned at Exxon back quite some time ago when they were doing climate change research. So they have had all the time, they have all the resources, they have all the smart people to decide that they want to jump on the clean energy bandwagon, and most of those companies, not all, but most of them have made a very conscious and deliberate decision that they would rather fund disinformation campaigns than change the way they do energy. But people who work for companies absolutely need to be considered. Think of coal miners. What they do is difficult, and it's dangerous, and it's unhealthy, and their families live in places where the water is often polluted, as we saw in Appalachia. That's why I think one of the smartest things to do is to make polluters pay, put a price on carbon, like they've had in British Columbia since 2007, and then refund most of that money to people through their taxes in a transparent way so it doesn't disappear into people, government's pockets, but reserve some of that money to train people for the new energy economy. And that's actually happening, of course, you guessed it, in Texas. Because in Texas, a number of oil patch workers lost their job when oil prices increased, not due to anything related to climate change and clean energy, just due to the fluctuations in the market. So a number of workers lost their jobs, and because solar is booming across Texas, a bunch of smart companies snapped them up and built a training program to train out-of-work oil patch workers to do solar installations instead. I think that is the way of the future because we need to put people first. There will be the winners and there will be losers, but right now we are all going to be losers if we don't hasten this transition. So thank you. Great question. Other questions?
I have one in the back. So when you look at the Gallup polls, 65% of Americans think that the climate change is a serious issue, but it's not on one of the top 11 most important issues facing the U.S. How do you get that minority of people who choose climate change as the most important issue we're facing to encourage the majority of the U.S. citizens who think stuff like federal election reform or terrorism or the economy in general is more important to push climate change up that list of things our politicians talk about and are working on?
Great question. That's something I think about quite a bit. The reason why we are in this situation we are is not because most people don't think climate change is real. 70% of the U.S. does. It's not because people aren't worried. Like you just said, the latest polls say 65% of people are worried about climate change. So why are we not doing more about it? It's because we think it is a separate issue. We consider climate change as this separate polar bear issue over here, and then we have agriculture and terrorism and refugee crisis and immigration over here as other issues. One of the biggest things I have learned is that on my priority list of what matters to me in my life, climate change is not a separate item on the list. I care about it because it affects the things that are already on my list. Climate change affects the health of my child. Climate change affects the security of the world we live in. Climate change affects the agricultural economy of the state that I live in. Climate change affects our water resources and how much water we have and whether we're in drought restrictions and how long those droughts last. Climate change affects my electricity bill in the summer. When we had a heat wave in 2011, we had, I am not joking, a 4-digit electricity bill in the summer. And we are not big on the air conditioning, I can promise you that. Climate change affects all of the things that are already on our priority list, and that is why I think the most important thing to do is to draw those connections. And nobody is drawing those connections better, in my opinion, than the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has funded major studies showing that climate change is a threat multiplier. In other words, it takes a place or an issue that is already on the edge, and climate change just reaches out and pushes it over the edge. A couple of years ago, the Admiral of the Pacific, so the guy who's in charge of the whole Navy in the Pacific, including around North Korea, when North Korea was doing some saber rattling, he was asked, what do you think is the greatest threat facing the United States today? And you know what he said? He said climate change. He didn't say North Korea. So that is the type of connection that we need to see being made in every sector, in the health sector, in the business sector, where Hank Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury, wrote a report called Risky Business a couple of years, where he talked specifically about the economic damages from climate change. The insurance industry has been connecting the dots for years. Why? Because they're footing the bill. Did you know in Minnesota, home insurance rates have increased 300% in the last 20 years because of increased flood risk? The insurance industry knows this is real and they're connecting the dots. So that, I think, is what's going to address this issue, is when other groups and organizations connect the dots and say, hey, this is a national defense issue. Hey, this is a home security issue. Hey, this is an agriculture issue. And so one of the groups I work with is Iowa farmers. What we did for Iowa farmers is something kind of unique. We're trying something out. We took a group of farmers that we knew were, a bit doubtful about this whole climate change thing. Man cannot control the weather, God's in control, it's just a natural cycle, was, their input coming into the meeting. So we talked about what's already been happening, and yes, it is definitely getting warmer and the floods are getting worse. And then what we did was we used a model to predict crop yield that they're very comfortable with and they're very familiar with and they use on a regular basis from season to season. We took that crop yield model and we put in the conditions for when the world gets warmer by 1 degree, by 1.5 degrees, and by 2 degrees. Those of you who follow the news know that there was a big meeting in Paris last year where 195 countries from around the entire world all came together because they realized that not fixing this thing was more expensive than fixing it. And in Paris, the entire world, including the US, agreed to limit global warming to at least 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees if possible. So you go to Iowa farmers and they're like, well, what does that mean to me? I don't know. I mean, it's 2 degrees warmer outside my house anyway, so who cares? We showed them what would happen to their crops on an average year if the world warms by 1.5 and 2 degrees. They looked at that and they said, okay, 1.5 we can adapt to. We can plant more densely, we can change our irrigation techniques, we can prepare for that world, but the 2-degree world, we can't fix that. That will not work. All of a sudden, this group of farmers that came in saying, you know, I'm not really sure about this thing, they're saying, we have a position on the Paris Agreement. Why? Because we connected their crop yields directly to these targets. And so that's the type of work I specifically do in my research, because I believe if we connect those dots, each of us already has the values we need to care about climate change. We just have to figure out what those values are and connect them. We don't have to instill new values. So, John, you had a question?
I'm interested in terms of faith-based institutions that you visited. If you could give us some examples of institutions that you think have really leveraged their mission and connected it in some sort of active fashion to the issue of climate change, and what that action or what those examples might have looked like that really caught your eye.
Sure. I can think of examples all the way from, small ones to big ones. One church decided that they were going to have their youth group go to all the seniors' homes and replace all their light bulbs for them. Because if you're a senior, getting up on a ladder is really tough and it's scary. And so they decided that they wanted to help people save money and also never have to replace their light bulbs again. So they got the youth group to go out and replace all the light bulbs in all the seniors' homes with, whatever type of bulb they wanted. You don't have to get those, fluorescent, nasty bulbs. You get really nice ones these days. And that just stuck in my mind because it was such a small thing, but it was so tangible, and it was a loving thing to do because they were actually thinking about what people's needs were. One university, not to be competitive or anything, but one university that I really respect for leveraging their resources is Houghton, which I showed before here with the solar panels. I mean, if you don't know where Houghton is, it's in upstate New York, and it is not exactly a sunny haven there. So the amount of sun they get there is nothing compared to the amount of sun that you get here. But they still made that decision because they crunched the numbers and because their president is absolutely committed to being a witness in this area. They did it as a witness. So they have sustainability programs. They have a director of sustainability. I went to Houghton because they actually wanted to do an experiment, which I love. They said, do you know if when you talk to people it makes a difference? And I said, well, anecdotally, from talking to people, I think it does, I hope it does. And they said, well, let's do an experiment. We'll bring you in, we'll get all the students together, we'll do surveys beforehand, we'll do surveys afterwards, we'll have half the students watching a video instead of seeing you live. We'll see if it actually makes a difference. And it did make a difference. And so now I actually know that this does make a difference, it helps. So they're doing some pretty cool stuff, and I just love the way that they're very conscious of this, even though probably about half their student body would be in the camp of saying, well, I'm not really sure about this whole thing. So it's not always easy. It's not always obvious what to do. I got called 2 years ago to go back to my home church that I went to during grad school, an E-Free church in Illinois, where they weren't quite ready for me to address the congregation. An E-Free church, we're kind of conservative. So I talked to the student group, and then I met with the pastoral staff down the basement with coffee and styrofoam cups. And our conversation was all about, okay, what can we do? Because they wanted to know what can we do. And so we were brainstorming. How about an energy audit of the church so that you can actually save money? Put up a big thermometer and show people how much money you're saving every month by making these changes. How about calling a local car dealership and saying, hey, let's get some fuel-efficient vehicles in the parking lot. Let people take them for a spin on Sunday and see what they look like. Let's save this money and then tell people we're going to spend it on missions, because we're a very missions-focused church, and if we can reduce our operating costs, that means we have more to spend on other people. So just little examples I've seen around have stuck with me for different reasons. None of them, some of them grandiose, some of them small and simple, But I think what stuck with me the most is the motivation behind all of them. That they were done out of caring for others, loving others, thinking of others, and thinking of how best we can be salt and light in this world.
Hi, hello. Over here on this side. Hi.
Hi.
So as we all know, especially in the United States, climate change is an incredibly political issue. Even though I really believe it should not be a political issue. You know, the super cynic in me says, "Oh, politicians are funded by big oil, and that's why it's a political issue." Although I know it's not that simple. But my question to you is, you know, in going around my day-to-day life, I do run into people who will not even sit down and have a conversation based purely on sort of their political leanings. They say, you know, particularly conservatives, I'm a conservative, and climate change is sort of the propaganda of the left or whatever it is. And so when you run into people that are like that, which it does represent a fair number of people, what is your response to someone who wouldn't even come into the room and listen to what you had to say today?
Yes, and there are many people of that type. So you're perfectly right. Surveys have shown that climate change has become one of the most politicized issues in the entire United States. It is currently beating out abortion, the death penalty, and gun rights in terms of how politicized it is. Climate change and immigration are pretty much the top two most politicized issues right now. And I also completely agree with you because a thermometer is not Democrat or Republican. It doesn't give you a different number depending on how you vote. And the trees and shrubs up the mountain are certainly not changing in response to the politics of the campus. They're changing in response to the climate conditions. So it should not be a political issue. What should be political are the solutions, not the science. And that actually gives us a clue. The reason why it is so political is because of the solutions, not the science. Many people have been told, and many people firmly believe, that fixing climate will ruin the economy, or it will give the government untold control over people's lives, or it will also usher in the Antichrist and the beast, according to a recent email I received. Not joking. But that also gives us a clue of where to start the conversation. Because if the real issue is not a problem with the science, which it shouldn't be because, as I said earlier today, the same physics that we use to build climate models, we use to build airplanes. And there's not a lot of people who are saying that the airplanes aren't quite sound and they should be investigated further before we use them. Most people are still using them today. If the issue is with the solutions, we can start our conversation with solutions. And if people try to start it with arguing about the science, don't fall for it. Arguing the science is like catnip in front of a cat. They subconsciously want you to chase that catnip so that they can then go away feeling completely justified in what they believe. Arguing the science only deepens the divide between us. So even if people start off trying to argue the science, introduce a solution. And I gave a funny example earlier today when we were talking about this at breakfast, but it's real. Man comes up to me, says, this whole thing is just a hoax invented by scientists. I say, no, it's not. And did you know that we get 20% of our energy from wind in Texas? He said, well, you're just doing it to line your pocket. And I said, no, I'm not. But we have enough solar potential here to supply the entire country. He said, now this is an extreme example. You don't necessarily want to be quite so crazy. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, well, these are the solutions to climate change. Do you have a problem with that? He's like, well, no, I mean, if that, I'm fine with Texas giving everybody electricity and making lots of money off it. And I was like, well, if we're fine about that, then we're on the same page, aren't we? And I know that was a very discombobulating conversation. I'm not quite sure what he went away with it from. And I would say that the majority of my conversations, they talk about solutions, but not in quite such a U-turn manner, a bit more subtle. But if we talk about solutions, we can come to surprising agreement with people who we may never agree with on the science, and we will certainly never agree with on the politics. Because thankfully and refreshingly, many of the solutions to climate change are common sense solutions. And many people don't know that. So if you're going to talk about climate change, if you're going to try to, if you're going to try to change this, the best way to start a conversation is by talking about a solution, and if you don't know what a solution is, watch my global wording videos. It will give you about 100 of them. because that's what I research for myself. I am a scientist. I don't study the solutions, but I've gone out and educated myself on solutions because I know that's what I have to talk to people about.